Well, hello and happy World Book Night. I'm Tony Curran. I'm a Senior Public Engagement Fellow at the University of Southampton's Public Engagement with Research Unit. We're celebrating three things at this event. Firstly, the Research Café. It's become known and loved over the past years, popping up in cafes all over the city to engage people with interesting discussions to stretch their grey matter. And this event is a Research Café milestone, our 40th event. So that makes me really excited. The second thing we're celebrating is it's the 10th anniversary of World Book Night. So to mark that, we will be asking for your favourite book and some recommendations from you watching a little bit later in the event. And most importantly, we're celebrating the release of Philip Hoare's new book, Albert and the Whale. And obviously much more on that to come. We're joined tonight also by Carol Burns, who's going to do an introduction to Philip. Carol is a fiction writer, a journalist and a lecturer and head of creative writing at the University of Southampton. So over to Carol.
Thank you so much, Tony. Welcome, everyone. It is delightful to have people here on this beautiful evening, and you're inside listening to a writer speak. I always love when that happens. So I am honored to introduce the writer and my inspiring colleague, Philip Hoare. I've tried to think through exactly what fascinates me about Philip's writing. And while there's a lot to be fascinated by, what I might find most interesting, and I think the aspect I most admire as a fellow writer, is how he pursues his obsessions. His first three books are dominated by writers and poets, Stephen Tennant, Oscar Wilde, Noel Coward, and then he moves to explore stories from the New Forest in Southampton with England's Lost Eden and Spike Island. Most recently, since Leviathan or The Whale was published in 2008, he has relentlessly pursued his obsession with whales and the sea, following that book with two others, The Sea Inside and Rising Tide, Falling Star. His books are part nature writing, part memoir, part history, part literary biography. Writers are never far away. And they range around like I imagine his attention does, finding synchronicities almost as if it's fate to do so. As anyone who follows his Twitter feed knows, Philip swims in the sea every day, often in the dark at 4 a.m, as if he too is a mammal who lives partly in the sea. This new book, Albert and the Whale, intertwines these two obsessions in a new way and with another type of artist, the printmaker, drawer, and painter Albrecht Dürer. He looks at his life and his art, including Dürer's fascination with weird, imaginative, and sometimes fictive depictions of animals. I love Philip's writing about Dürer's art here. And he goes on then to explore the artist's importance to writers such as Marianne Moore and Thomas Mann, and of course, Philip himself. Philip becomes, I think, the connective tissue among all these writers, artists, and subjects. And I can't wait to hear him talk about this fascinating book. On a personal note, I rate it a good day at work when I get to meet Philip on campus. Every time he walks into the musty lecture halls of this Russell Group University, wearing army boots and a waterproof and smelling of the sea, it's like he's brought the sea with him. And he has. When he's there, the sea's inside. So Philip and Tony, I hand over to you, and I can't wait to hear this discussion.
That's great. Thank you, Carol. I'm even more excited now. Just a quick announcement for those watching. Do post your questions and comments throughout the evening. We will come to them later for a bit of audience Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Philip.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you, Carol. That was a lovely introduction. Really, really sweet. In July 1520, Albrecht Dürer left his home in Nuremberg to travel by river all the way to the sea. From the dark heart of the continent and an imperial city full of power and technology to the Low Countries, all of which lay beneath the sea. It was a long journey, but an urgent one. He had to leave, not, as history tells us, because he was seeking the patronage of the new Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, but because a virulent new wave of the plague had swept over Nuremberg. The city was under emergency administration, locked down. Anyone who could afford to was fleeing. All the merchants and bankers climbed in their helicopters and flew to the safer shores of the Netherlands and its healthy sea air. Dürer duly arrived with his wife and maid in tow. It wasn't a close relationship. They ate in separate rooms. And waiting for the emperor to arrive, he heard news of a much stranger visitor. Out on the shores of Zeeland, a whale had been stranded, a vast leviathan a mile long. It was an angler's exaggeration, but the villagers feared the stink alone would kill them. Albert knew better than that. He'd read all about whales in his animal books. He knew they weren't hairy, scaly beasts spouting at the edge of outer space, but real, living, breathing creatures like himself. He'd even seen their bones hanging in Brussels Town Hall, of all places, masquerading as ancient giants. So Albert and his wealthy friends, drinking and gambling away their time in Antwerp, decided to go on a whale hunt. They couldn't go around it. It changed the artist's life. As the ship neared the shore, a great storm blew up. Tempest stuff. Suddenly, everything was up in the air. Carried on by an onshore wind, the ship crashed into the quayside long enough for most of the passengers to jump off. But then it blew back out to sea, and all seemed lost. I imagine Shakespeare overhearing Albert telling the story in the pub, how he took control of the situation like a hero and brought the ship back to shore. But in the biggest disappointment in all of art history, the mysterious whale had been washed away by the same storm. Dürer's ambition had been thwarted. Perhaps it was hubris biting back. So why was he so desperate to see the whale? He wanted to collect it, of course. Slide 1, please. Dürer was the first modern artist. We are shocked at the modernity of his gaze. He portrays animals with a lavish, intense, isolated detail that seems almost unnecessary. He gave them personhood, a sense of being in time and space. His hair twitches and crouches on his kitchen floor. She quivers with life. Second slide, please. Never mind that the next minute she would be in the pot. Likewise, his clump of weeds, a sod of earth dug up from some sodden field. No one drew dirt before Dürer. They didn't dare. It was blasphemous to declare any kind of equivalence between us and a bunny or a dandelion, letting fly its seeds on the warm summer air like a clock telling eternal time. Next slide, please. He even painted the Big Bang, an exploding meteorite falling to Earth, a cosmic sign of the forthcoming apocalypse, like a cinema trailer for doom and dismay. Or perhaps a new golden age that he foresaw for art. but most extraordinary of all was his rhino. A rhinoceros sent all the way from India by sea to King Manuel I of Portugal. Next slide, please. Yet Dürer never actually saw the living animal any more than he saw that whale. Instead, he relied on reports sent by his spies in the city. From their rough sketches and descriptions, he created a rhinoceros that was more rhino than any real rhino could be. A plated, cratered, contoured animal, more like a map or a planet or an armoured tank. Surreal. An image so vivid it would be reproduced on the wall of a 16th century Colombian villa as a Salvador Dali sculpture and on the bottle of wine I drank last night. This was the way the rhinoceros looked for 400 years before St. David Attenborough came along. The reason? Dürer was the first artist to reproduce his own work. Paintings were expensive and patrons annoying. Dürer sidestepped that process. And in the process, his art outlived him. His rhino was still being printed using the same woodblocks long after their maker had died. Art made Dürer immortal. That's why he wanted to draw the whale, to preserve it for eternity. And if he had, what then? Would we have seen these beautiful beasts, all but invisible for their size, as if they were too dangerous to look upon in their reality? Would we have appreciated them as emissaries from an as yet unspoilt ocean, ambassadors warning of threats yet to come? Would Dürer have saved the whale 500 years before Greenpeace? Was he the first friend of the earth? After all, art had saved him. He was his own natural history, recorded in portraits of himself. Next slide, please. Number one, as a grungy, grumpy teenager in 1495, earbuds entwined in his red locks, a red jellyfish hat on his head. He's weedy but buff, proud of that chest, the off-the-shoulder shirt. A rebel, his face isn't a mess. Sheer bloody arrogance to spend all that time painting yourself, the one image you'd never be able to sell. Number two, so he does it again, fresh and sophisticated from Venice in 1498, where he learned to fence and dance and acquired the alchemical secret of perspective. He's a thin white duke on the train, wearing Prada for the Passeggiata. Everything focuses on those hands, suave in their gloves. He's no mere artisan. Number three, the leper Messiah, escaping the plague, 1500, at the century's turn. His revolutionary monogram, AD, announces a new age, before and after Dürer. It's his portrait in the attic. Born in 1471, 29 years before, he will die in 1528, 29 years hence. He's at his peak halfway through his life, and see what he's achieved. He will never not be famous from this moment on. But there's always some fly in the ointment, some flaw in the firmament. He has a squint. One eye looks one way, one the other. Was that his secret? That he didn't see the way normal people do? Is that why his dog growled at this picture, this second Christ, looking back into the medieval past and into the future? How I wish I could see it, said Dürer. The irony is, his art killed him. like a tubercular hero high on laudanum, or a patient high on a magic mountain, that visit to the Low Countries had left him with a fever he couldn't shake. Was it malaria, bad air, caught from the Zeeland swamps? Or syphilis, a new import from the New World, along with all that stolen Aztec gold? Or was it a punishment from the Leviathan himself, star-born and star-cursed? Whatever the truth, Dürer's fever took his life. At the end, he looked like a bundle of withered straw, his friend said, scourged and worn out. That wonky eye looked off to one side fearfully, as if he'd seen the avenging angel of history, his own fate. Dürer died on the 6th of April, 1528, and was interred in a Nuremberg grave. His fans dug him up 3 days later. They took plaster casts of his face and hands to create a plaster saint. But it was a foolhardy and futile gesture. After all, he's still there on the wall. Next slide, please. Look at those eyes again. They seem stranger than ever. So strange that in 1900, 400 years after this painting was made, a stranger strolled into the Munich gallery with a portrait hung and scratched out those eyes with a hatpin. It was a violent act, an augury of a violent century that would abduct Dürer's art for its own nefarious ends. And yet, in those eyes, Dürer endures and leaves us with the questions he asked. Can art save us? Is it a curse? What is beauty? He paused long enough to answer himself. I don't know, he said. So last slide, please. Thank you.
That's great. I think that was a really nice opening to not just tonight's event, but obviously the book and the stories within it. So thank you for that, Philip.
Thank you.
Let's do some questions, shall we?
Yeah.
I'm gonna dart around potentially a little bit in no particular order in terms of the types of questions I'm asking here. And hopefully that's okay, but let's see how it goes. So can I start with a question on what I know is close to your heart, Philip, animals, and specifically whales. They're referred to throughout the book, and as you've alluded to, Dürer had his own kind of deep interest in not only whales but other animals and capturing them in his works. But those watching, we have to try and imagine what it was like 500 years ago when he lived. And it wasn't very easy to see animals in the flesh then, was it?
Depends what kind of animals you're talking about. I mean, where he lived in Nuremberg, wolves patrolled the city walls, and there were deer, bison, that sort of animal, the land animal that now would seem really extraordinary if you walked around Nuremberg. If you imagine looking over the wall and instead of pret-a-manger, you saw a bison walking past. But as you say, most of the animals that we're familiar with, and of course most of the animals we're familiar with are the ones that are featured on natural history documentaries, which of course are very widespread now and everything, but that would have been an impossibility. Most people had never seen a whale. And those people who had seen a whale, for instance, people who were living on the coast of Zeeland and Netherlands, where there were frequent strandings of whales, saw the dead animals, which are like deflated bicycle tires. They're very limp, substanceless versions of the magnificent creatures that whales are. And of course, all animals, all of nature, all of the natural order was invested with symbolic power, sometimes with magical power, powers to influence your fate, that reflected your fate or might reflect Christian theology, of course. The hair, for instance, the hair that he painted is a symbol of resurrection in Christian typology. And a whale, of course, was featured in the Book of Genesis as one of the sea serpents, the terrible monsters that inhabited the ocean's deep and that swallowed Jonah. So it's very difficult for anyone to see animals as they were as animals. There's a whole layer of meaning in between themselves and animals. But that's why Dürer's paintings of plants and animals are extraordinary, because they seem to cut through that veil. They sort of take away the fourth wall, and suddenly you are there in the face of a hare, or a clump of weeds, or a rhinoceros, or a walrus. He painted many, many animals. He's painted far more animals than he ever needed to for studies, for other paintings. He really didn't need to do that. So he was obviously very interested in animals.
Yeah, and I will come back to the theme of animals later. But maybe what I wanted to do now is, and we'll come back to Dürer obviously in a moment, but quite early on in the book, you talk about how, well, later on in the book, you talk about how Dürer was the inspiration for so many people that followed. But quite early on in the narrative, you take us back hundreds of years again before Dürer lived, and to the interesting character of Albertus Magnus. And I wondered if you wanted to tell us a bit about him and about how Dürer might have got some inspiration from him.
Well, Albertus Magnus was an early medieval theologist, alchemist, doctor, explorer. He was one of the few people who really did see these animals. He went to the Baltic coast to observe whaling. He saw whales. He knew what they were like. He knew what they were composed of. He knew they were mammals. They weren't dragons. He saw people hunting them. He compiled an animal encyclopedia, incredibly compendious work, which we're pretty sure Dürer had probably as a young boy, much in the way that you and I were brought up in books about dinosaurs or whatever. He had this book, and certainly his father was using drawings from that. His father was a silver worker and a jeweler in Nuremberg, a Hungarian refugee, in fact, or expatriate. So Dürer was very aware of the representation of animals from Albertus's book. Albertus he taught Thomas Aquinas. He had an important impact on modern philosophy. But in Dürer's case, I think he probably inculcated in the young Albert Dürer this sense of animals for their own sake. They're not just symbols. They are real creatures.
Yeah. Okay. We'll come back to animals again later. Think back on Dürer, from reading Albert and the Whale, I've learned how pioneering Dürer is considered to have been. One part of that is from his move from paint to engravings, and the famous set referred to as the three master engravings, Night, Death and the Devil, St. Jerome in his study, and then most famous, I think, Melancholia one. So I just wondered what your thoughts are on that and the engravings.
Well, of course, Nuremberg was it was the Silicon Valley of the early Renaissance. I mean, it was where technology was being born. Printing was a new technology. It was scary. Martin Luther thought it was too dangerous to unleash on the general public. It was more groundbreaking, really, than the internet now. I mean, you imagine suddenly information was internationally available to those of you people who could afford to read the books or go to a monastic library, and those who learned to read. But it was an extraordinary technology, and Dürer used it to its maximum potential. In Nuremberg, there were 100 printing presses, and Dürer set up his own studio, printing his own work. This was absolutely revolutionary. No artist had printed their own work. And it's almost as though he was photocopying. So he's rather like Warhol in a way, screen printing his own images. And of course, he was employing assistants to do that. So it was really mass reproduction in the way that Warhol produced his screen prints. And Dürer was selling them through agents all around Europe. So they were appearing in Britain, in Norway, Hungary, Venice, Italy. So they had enormous physical impact, as well as the impact of his images themselves, which were transcendent. Erasmus said that Dürer did in black and white what other artists could only do in color. And he did that in a single line illustration, just woodcuts, which were just a single line, and his illustrations of the Apocalypse, which were the first big hit in 1498, were astonishing. They were like a Japanese anime cartoon in a way, that he brought these dungeons and dragons and monsters to life as a kind of augury of the apocalypse that people thought was coming. The second coming was expected. People were building tall towers to escape the coming deluge. So he gave voice and form to those fears. And these pictures were being pasted up on walls, on wardrobes, much in the way as your modern pin-up walls, So, and then when he comes to the three engravings you talk about, which even now we don't really know how he drew those. I mean, I know artists, brilliant modern artists, who've tried to replicate Dürer's engravings, and that's almost impossible to do. There's something quite magical about them. When you see them, because most of us, we see them printed in books, when you actually see the thing in real life. And I saw John Ruskin's own copy of Melancholia, which is an early run of the print edition. It's something you just feel as you can fall into this world, this strange melancholy angel who's kind of ungendered. And we think, the way we see that image is of a sadness, and we think that the angel is scowling or looking depressed. When you look at it, their face is smiling, because melancholia is a creative state. It's a meditative state. It's an active state of creation. So yeah, those images, and as you say, Tony, especially those three images, they become some of the most discussed works of art ever in the history of art. The Melancholia, people are still trying to explain that. I mean, it inspired people like Jean-Paul Sartre, Thomas Mann, George Bernard Shaw, William Morris, Marianne Moore, Patti Smith, a huge, great gallery of people who've been drawn to that image because of its mysterious power.
Yeah. And it's just, again, it's that sense of wonder that I had kind of, learning these stories through reading the book, how it must have been like 500 years ago, the efforts to go and see this whale, this massive transformation of how things were made in engravings and reproduction. Yeah. And trying to think how that must have been. It's almost impossible for us 500 years on to think about that. Just a short follow-on question. It's probably the kind of question that people hate answering, so forgive me for that. But so they're considered some of his best works. You've been, intimately, exploring and researching Dürer. Are they his best works? What are your views on that?
The three engravings are beyond astonishment. I went to see, the first time I saw them in the flesh was in Boston in 2010, and I'd been in a gallery next door, which is a gallery full of old masters, very dark, musty old pictures, and suddenly I walked into this room where the Dürer's engravings were hanging, and it was like I walked into a kind of heaven. He did imagine heaven. I mean, his imagination alone, as realized in those images, they are incredibly powerful. And then later on, I saw another display of one of the first edition prints of the, because we have various editions of those prints, which were printed in Dürer's lifetime, because the first ones are the best because the plate is still pristine. And it was in Milan. It was in a gallery close to the cathedral. And I walked in. I was the first person in this gallery in the morning. I queued up outside to wait to get in. And I stood in front of Melancholia. And it was the first time I'd seen Melancholia itself in a pristine print. And I was so overcome. I grabbed the gallery attendant and I said, look at this. Have you ever seen anything like this? This poor woman must have thought I was the loony who just wandered in from the streets and thought she was going to have to call for assistance to escort me from the premises. But I was just so physically excited by being drawn into it. The thing about it is there's a childlike wonder to Dürer. Those images draw you in. You want to be in there. You want to be there with the angel, or with Jerome and his lion, or the knight and the devils, and the knight's trusty dog running along beside him. You are in that story. I mean, he's almost like Shakespeare in a way. He is a dramatist. He creates these scenes which it was the equivalent to cinema at the time.
Yeah, and it was great to have you guiding us through how to look at some of these pictures in a way, because there is so much detail in them. And looking at you've got some fantastic prints at the back of the book, and that's great to look at them. But again, until you then read the text that you've written, there's so many things that you don't notice in them, and I'm sure seeing them in the flesh and bigger would be much better. One of the pictures that I loved that you did show it earlier, maybe we can show it again for a moment, the rhinoceros. I did love Dürer's rhinoceros. There it is. And it was Earth Day yesterday, and I'll probably come back to that in a moment. But just on this particular image, one question I had for you was, do you think Dürer tried to be as true to life as possible, or that he intentionally embellished this painting?
Or it's certainly the latter, because if you look at the back of the rhinoceros, he's stuck an extra horn in the back of the animal just for good luck. And actually the horn is a narwhal tusk from the polar cetacean, which the tusk of which was believed to be the original tusk of a unicorn. So he's sort of maxed out the animal and given it magical qualities. It's almost Narnia animal, or from a Philip Pullman book. There's something very strange, but actually it's pretty near a rhino for someone who never saw one. And those spots on the side which people have questioned, we discovered since actually that because the rhino was brought on deck from India by ship, fungus started growing on the poor beasts outside, so those spots actually really were there. But there's something so magnificent about this image, which to me is emblemized by the fact that he makes it so you can't fit it in the frame. Look, the horn, the tusk is right up to the edge of one frame, and his tail is right up to the frame of the other. It's like the animal's so big, it's trying to get out of this frame, and it wants to like gallop into the out of the picture. Imagine the power of that. I mean, it was one of his best-selling images. It was just like, it would have been for anyone who'd never seen any kind of real animal. And of course, they'd seen dragons, they'd seen things in stained glass and windows on Sundays, But to see something like this, and then someone to say, no, actually, that is a real animal, must have been mind-blowing.
Yeah. And in a way, a bit of this word melancholy comes up in the story again, to do with melancholia and around Dürer's kind of views on this. There must be a bit of melancholy or misfortune maybe on Dürer's part. He had some great experiences during his life, but to not have actually come face to face with a whale or a rhino and some of these things that I'm sure he would have loved to have done.
Yeah, I think he would have done, but then it's a bit like not wanting to meet your heroes, isn't it? It's like sometimes the fantasy is better than the truth. I mean, like his picture of a walrus, which people think it's a drawing of a real walrus, but actually sort of in the book I prove it isn't, because he gives this walrus whiskers where walruses don't have whiskers. So again, it's another question of sort of him embroidering on the truth. But he was a traveled artist. You know, he went to Venice, he went to the Netherlands, he traveled a lot around the German lands, and the great Habsburg Empire, of course, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was his patron, gave him a passport, which meant he could travel freely throughout the empire. And of course, the empire included the Netherlands. But he wasn't well traveled in modern terms. But imagine how difficult it was to travel then. You know, he had to go by river most of the time if he could, because it's the safest way to go and the quickest. But even then, it took him weeks to get to Antwerp from Nuremberg. And along the way, he had all sorts of adventures. And I think he probably met in one of the castles on his way, I think he probably met the original Faust, Johannes Faust, in the great story of Mephistopheles and Faustus. So his life would have been wreathed around with myth and reality. You know, that his currency in trade was fantasy in a way. And especially if you consider the biblical images to be fantastical, which they are, of course, because we don't know what those scenes really look like. So, you know, the great thing was he allowed his imagination to travel with him. And of course, his art traveled with him. He paid his way by selling his art alongside. Yeah. Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier you went to Boston, and I know you've been and seen some other of Dürer's works in other places. But I don't know the answer to this one, so maybe you could shed some light. Are there any of Dürer's works on display in the UK at the moment?
Well, very, very fortuitously, this November, the National Gallery are having a big exhibition of Dürer's work, and it's postponed from February for obvious reasons. That's going to be so great. If you like Dürer or like the idea of him, would like to see those works in real life, and have a really good exhibition of them there. Some of the works, like the hair and the turf that I showed you, his blue roller, which is a kind of wonderful, almost bird of paradise. They can't travel from the gallery, the Albertina, which is in Vienna, because they're so fragile. They are, even the curator was very reluctant even to take them out of the storeroom. I had to go down to the storeroom, this great bunker below the museum, and be shown these, which was wonderful because I just had this amazing private view of my own of these monumental, you know, images beyond price. You know, I mean, they're just, you know, and so fugitive and so strange. You know, the hair was painted. He painted the hairs with a single hairbrush. But there's that wonderful Big Bang, the meteor, is actually in the National Gallery, usually on permanent display there, as with a couple of portraits. But generally, most of Dürer's work is in European galleries. Yeah.
Great. Okay, I've made a note to keep an eye on the National Gallery. Thank you. I'll come back to animals again in a moment, as I've threatened to do. But maybe if we just think now a little bit forward in time about, you know, some of the legacy of Dürer and some of the inspiration that he gave to so many others that followed. I think I read something about the Dürerbund marking the 400th anniversary, and maybe I think there were hundreds of thousands of followers of Dürer then, which is just amazing to think of. But then in particular, there are some 20th century writers and poets that you talk about who were admirers or great followers of Dürer. You know, W.H. Auden was mentioned, Christopher Isherwood, and then quite a lot the German Mann family. And maybe we'll come back to we'll come back to Marianne Moore again afterwards, but just some of those characters in the 20th century and the relations that they had with Dürer. Did you want to say anything on that?
Well, it was very interesting to me because I knew I had to deal with Dürer in the 20th century because he becomes problematic in the 20th century because he's adopted by fascism as a kind of literally a poster for the values of an Aryan race. And the irony is they used that last portrait we saw of him, the 1500 one of him as Christ, completely ignoring the fact that he's painted himself as a Jew and that he's the son of a Hungarian refugee. So there's a degree of irony there. But why I really like the work of Thomas Mann is that he took up that sense of Dürer's romantic legacy, which really built up to a crescendo in the 19th century with Wagner and Nietzsche and Goethe. And he takes that and he says, you can't do this to an artist. You can't co-opt an artist for your political ends. And I'm going to stop you doing that. And he stops people doing it by creating a different view of that Germanness. He writes this amazing book, Dr. Faustus, using the legend of Faust, only instead of Faust, he has an avant-garde composer, Adrian Leverkuhn, and he creates in him a kind of modern Dürer who's living through the Second World War. I don't want to spoil the book for anyone who wants to read it, but there's some very interesting parallels there that he draws with Dürer and what goes on during the Second World War and what's been going on since the 30s. What's really interesting about Mann is the way that he represents the resistance to that, the artistic resistance. Both his children, well, he has 6 children, 3 of them are gay, most famously Erica and his bloody name now. His son Klaus. It's amazing. It was time to give with this. And they become cabaret entertainers during the oncoming dictatorship, and in fact they were booted out of Germany along with Thomas Mann. So Mann relocates to New York and later on to Los Angeles. So you have this amazing notion that he's writing about he's filtering medieval Dürer through 1940s Germany in this apocalyptic scenario, only he's in Los Angeles hanging out with Johnny Weissmuller and Marlene Dietrich under palm trees. And it's those things. How did that happen to Dürer? I mean, it's just like amazing. And so Dürer moves through time. He's a time traveler, and he sort of changes shape according to what the time demands. He's one of Andy Warhol's favorite artists, and Dürer's praying hands, or another really famous image that Dürer created, is carved on Andy Warhol's grave, which is filmed 24/7. Like, you can switch off from me now if you want and switch on to the scenes of Warhol's grave. The portrait of Dürer with the of Christ was replicated by Robert Mapplethorpe in a photograph of Patti Smith in exactly the same pose, the long curly hair. It's a measure of an artist that he can transpose his aesthetic through cultures and time zones, political dispensations, and still remain elusive.
Yeah, it is. And I suppose the other figure I alluded to there, Marianne Moore, there's, again, homage to Dürer in her work. She literally refers to him several times in her own poetry, as do some of the Manns. And so that's really interesting, isn't it? And again, I wonder if you, through the research that you've done, whether it's, things that you learned about Marianne Moore or about the Manns, living through that time, that with World War erupting around them and having to move around. And from your research, can you give a sense of what it must have been like for them to live during those times?
Well, the reason why I was really interested in the Manns and especially in Marianne Moore, is because they occupy, really one of my favorite periods, or the period that really interests me and has done since I was a young teenager. Partly inspired by Cabaret and Isherwood and Goodbye to Berlin, and is that Germany in the 30s, 20s and 30s. And of course, the Mann family are really absolutely part of that, and Isherwood knew them because his friend Auden married Erica Mann. Although they were both gay, she married him so she could escape and get a British passport. Marianne Moore, big friend of Thomas, she knew Thomas Mann, but she knew Auden very well. And T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. She was the most extraordinary poet, and she was very directly affected by Dürer's exhibition of works, as you alluded to, the 400th anniversary of his work, of his death in 1928. There were exhibitions of his work in New York as well as throughout Germany and Europe. And she saw the prints of the rhinoceros and other works by him, and she was love struck. She described him as this kind of prince in this wonderful Renaissance garb. It's almost he was her suitor. And she has a remarkable life. She was born in St. Louis the same year as T.S. Eliot, so she's a complete peer of Eliot's. But she ended up living in Greenwich Village with her mother. She and her mother shared the same bed for 40 years. All of most of Marianne's married life until adult life, until her mother died in the 1940s. And she seemed to be this kind of sort of spinsterish figure, kind of a librarian, but she was the most extraordinary modernist poet, creating these poems. She wrote this poem called An Octopus, in which the octopus changes from a glacier into a cliff, and then to a kind of a fossilized animal, and then back into something else. She was a very surreal modernist imagination, but one which really drew on the past. And yet she ended up writing the liner notes for Muhammad Ali's album "I Am the Greatest." She said he was the best poet since Sir Philip Sidney, who's an Elizabethan courtier sort of poet. I really fell in love with her. It's just a wonderful figure. Yeah.
And so on another completely new topic, but also bringing us back to Dürer slightly and his time. One of the things you mentioned about the fact that it's quite a bit of feedback. I might just mute, and then I'll bring you back on in a sec. So you've talked about quite a few of these characters who are inspired by Dürer being gay. Whether it's Marianne Moore, Erica Mann, the other Manns, Isherwood, Auden, maybe some relations as well. On the theme of LGBT representation in history and in art, one thing I noted, being from Liverpool myself, the Walker Art Gallery does a lot on this. There's a current project called Pride and Prejudice, for example, which is specifically there to identify items across the National Museum's Liverpool collections with an LGBT connection. So we know a lot about, the history and the connections and the LGBT representation in the 20th century, but it gets harder as we go further back. So I wondered if in your research of Dürer and that period of time, you came across any LGBT connections or if you suspected any there lurking out of sight.
I don't know. I don't like the idea of putting labels on things. All my life I've avoided labels because I think that's what got us into trouble in the first place. And what I really like about the conversations I had with art historians and curators about whether or not what Dürer's sexual interests were. It's very interesting because, of course, at that point you weren't defined by that kind of identity. It didn't exist. It didn't even exist up until the 19th century. So it really wouldn't have occurred to anyone to call someone homosexual. You might commit sodomitical acts if you're a man, but that didn't reflect on your sexual identity. So when Dürer draws beautiful boys, which he did, he draws them because he loves them and he finds them attractive. But people wouldn't call him out for that particularly. They might if he was, you know, doing stuff. So it's just a different thing, you know, and again, that's what I really like, the ambiguity of things, of the way that art, I think art does not have a duty to represent diversity, or it doesn't have a duty. There's no, art has no responsibility. It's, I really love, there's this wonderful painting that Dürer made of, it's a portrait called, its title, at least its original title, seems to have been Portrait of a Girl with a Red Hat, or Red Beret in sometimes, some instances. And this portrait is painted, we think, in Venice when he went there on his second visit. And 100 years after his death, it appears in Berlin being sold as Portrait of a Boy with a Red Hat. And then 100 years later, it becomes Portrait of a Girl with a Red Hat. So I really love that. I mean, I really love that. That's what I really like. And that's what art can do, you know. It's, so it challenges you. What do you think you are? And, you know, are you necessarily the same thing as you were then? So I don't know. I'm being a bit sort of mischievous, but it's, you know, as a young person, you want to try and find role models. That's when my role model was the Starman, and in him I saw all sorts of possibilities. And I really like the fact that there were no labels to what he was or what he was doing, and he was evoking all sorts of possibilities. I always find labels lock down possibilities. They seem to me to be patriarchal things themselves. People explaining things to you, what you should think about this thing, and how you've satisfied this category, you've ticked off this box. That's what I always fight against.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's great. And the other kind of area I said I wanted to come back to is animals. So, you know, they're peppered through the book. As I said earlier, it was Earth Day yesterday. I did love hearing how 500 years ago, you know, these walruses and rhinos and whales, they were more myth and legend than natural to a lot of people. And just to bring it back to the here and now, there's a documentary at the moment that's really popular called Seaspiricy. And, you know, this is exploring the impact that humans are having on the seas and those who live in them. And, you know, there's some reference in your book about, you know, the threat that humans have on some species. You know, you mentioned whales and rhinos. You talk about the Steller sea cow at one point. And so in that whole kind of sphere, you know, do you worry about the future of biodiversity and humans' impact?
It's all gone. It's just going. I mean, 90% of some species, you know, and some genera, it's just, it's too late. When you speak to scientists, they almost laugh at you. You know, I've written a lot about these things. I try not to, I never use language like that, but in my books, but I still try and allow some sense of optimism, but I don't see any. I'm sorry. And you know, we tried to save the whale in the 1980s, and more whales are dying now than ever before. Not from hunting, but from the noise pollution is one of the most important things for whales. You know, I mean, the ocean, which was pretty much silent 100 years ago, a bit more, 150 years ago, now is this cacophonous, infernal hell for an animal which lives by sound. An animal lives through sound in the water. It's the most, I mean, the sight is not so, and every animal, every organism its existence is predicated on that. And Dürer's time really saw the beginning of the, you know, of that deleterious effect we have on the environment. You know, animals were already going extinct. The pine marten, the fur that supplied him with the collar of that amazing coat he's wearing in the 1500 portrait, was already being driven to extinction by people wearing fur coats. I mean, that sounds like a modern thing, but that was happening back in 1500. Whales were already being driven. So the North Atlantic right whale had already pretty much been driven to extinction in the Eastern Atlantic. So had the grey whale. Doesn't take much for humans to mess up the world. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're right. There's no need to apologise on behalf of humanity there, because you know, it's right what you said. I do still have some sense of optimism. You know, we're definitely still going in the wrong direction, and it is quite bleak. But the event last night, I don't want to hijack tonight's event, but the event last night, the video is online if people want to watch it on this same channel. But,
no, it's important to be optimistic, because otherwise you do completely give up hope. But I'm really worried about animals, from insects to whales, you know. But the thing, you at the same time as being optimistic, you can't pussyfoot around. You can't give people like a get-out clause saying, if you just recycle your plastic bottles, you're going to save the world's population of ants. You're not. You know, it's not going to happen. It has to be systemic change.
yeah.
We need a golden age that Dürer hoped for.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, coming back to the matter at hand, and also just raising again the point I said at the beginning. It's Research Café number 40 tonight, and you know, I'm so grateful that you've joined us for this great event to mark it. You know, as part of a Research Café event, maybe we could think about the research process behind the book for a moment, and you know. I suppose, you know, how the book came to be. And one reference I found in the book is where you said, whether Dürer saw a sea monster himself remains a mystery, despite you having, I think, swum through libraries and sailed through oceans. So yeah, the research process behind writing a book like this.
It's a very good question, because you just actually answered it. The research process was swimming. I realized that, because everywhere I have to swim every day, so I swim every day in the sea, as Carol said. And of course, if you're in Nuremberg, you can't swim in the sea unless you get jetted to the Adriatic or something. So I swam in the Pegnitz, which is the river which ran past Dürer's home. This fast-running brown river overhung by trees, and it's only later I learned that there's still debris there from the Second World War, of course, because Nuremberg was blown 90%. Blown to bits by Allied bomb raids, and I don't think I would have gone in if I thought of what might lie below me. When I went to Paris, I swam in the Seine, off the quay that's opposite Notre Dame, for which I could have been immediately arrested. I was at 6 o'clock in the morning. It's amazing, because the Parisians are not early risers, and there was no one there to see me with my kit off, jumping into the Seine. Aladdin Seine, as you might say. But and then in Turin, I swam in the Po, which is a filthy river. But as I was swimming there, there was a a real rat swam past me. In Amsterdam, I swam in the canals. In Madrid, which is really difficult. That was the most challenging thing of all, to find somewhere to swim in Madrid. And Philip II's royal hunting ground, which is where the Prado Palace and the gallery, and where the wonderful second portrait of Dürer is held, the Venetian one. the black and white one. The park there has a huge ornamental pond. And so I got in there before dark. And again, I heard afterwards there have really large carp in this pond, which carp can bite you. Fish often do bite me, though. They bite me in the solent, but carp can really bite. And so my research process was to swim through the book. And I don't know why. I don't know why I have to do that, but it feels, when you swim places, you have to find the places to swim. So you have to go down often places where you shouldn't be. And you're at a different level. You're at an animal level with the place, with the city. So you see it from an animal's point of view, whether it is a rat or a cetacean or whatever. And it just becomes another way of inhabiting a place and not feeling as though you're just this token tourist. And because a lot of my books, up until certainly the Sea Inside, Rising Tide, Falling Star, and Leviathan, were very much set in America. Because there were a lot about Melville, a lot about Wales and whaling. I really wanted to go back to Europe, and it was a very purposeful decision to do that. I wanted to write about Europe because of the referendum, and I was very angry about that, and from a cultural point of view. And so I sort of made this kind of tour of the great galleries and museums as a really way of celebrating those, as the miracle of those places. And of course, I couldn't have done it now. That would have been impossible now. I mean, maybe in a couple of years, I don't know, hopefully. But yes, it seemed like I was, because I could go. You're going sort of backstage, as it were, in the museums to see things in the collections, like the original rhinoceros the painting that he made the engraving from, and the hare and the large turf in Vienna, and the 1500 portrait in Munich. It's when you see those places in the paintings within their cultural context, they have a lot more power. You kind of see, because they're often surrounded by other works of the period, for instance. So you see what other people are doing. You see how extraordinary Dürer is. When you see him set up against other painters, he's like, there's no one like him, nothing else like him. He's really unique. He really is. You can't have degrees of uniqueness, but he is unique. All art is unique, but he is. There's something almost alchemical or magical about it. There's almost as though, I almost float this idea that he did have a kind of Faustian pact, that he agreed to sell his soul for art. It's not true, but it is. I think it probably is true that Dürer was in the same palace as Faust at one point. So it could have been true. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the research. Well, sorry to play, but the thing about writing about an artist is that you sort of are in contact with them. They are dead, but I'm in contact with his genes. I've got his genes in front of me. There are his fingerprints and his saliva, and sometimes his hair in those works of art. It's as near as I'm ever going to get to Albrecht Dürer. So it's when you're writing about someone who's dead, their art is the nearest way you get to their mind as well as their physical presence. So the book is really an impersonation of Dürer, or an impression of Dürer. I'm trying to feel like Dürer felt, or how people felt about Dürer. And trying to let go of my, need to footnote things or source things or chapter and verse for things, because art doesn't work like that. No artist gives chapter and verse for their work. So I tried to like approach it in a very free way.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'm conscious that we've gone past 8 o'clock already, and I did want to draw some questions from those watching. So just as a reminder for those who are watching, do please post some questions and we'll come to those shortly. And I did note that there was one comment, Philip, as you were talking about getting in the river, or rather in the canal in Amsterdam. Somebody who's watching is from Amsterdam, and they said they're quite dirty, so be careful.
I know. I was careful about the app when I went in, but yeah.
Okay, so maybe a holding question, and again, it might be something that you're not too keen, or you know, to kind of to go into great details on, but almost a double question just to bide us over while we get questions from the audience in. There are so many interesting things explored in Albert in the Whale, but you know, and you've kind of already answered this in several times already. But so part one of the question, really generic one: why did you want to write this book? Why did you want to write this book? And then part connected to that, you know, you told us about Thomas Mann, and I read in the book how he preferred to write by the sea, for example, and you yourself have a deep affinity for the sea. So why did you want to write this book, and how do your books take shape, or if either of those spark something from you?
I wanted to write about it, partly because what I said about Europe. I was really keen. I've loved art since I was a tiny boy, you know, and I've loved dressing up ever since I was a tiny boy. Dürer loved dressing up. I used to dress up as a Renaissance prince. Sorry, that does sound ridiculous, but I did. My mother used to make me a doublet and like a velvet hat, big fluffy velvet hat. In suburban Southampton, you can imagine that went down really well. But I love all those clothes. I love the strangeness of it, and I love the Dürer's really the reason why I was drawn to Dürer, apart from the art, but along with the art is the most important thing, is the fact that he documented himself so obsessively as a person, as an individual, as an artist, not as an artisan. As I said, he's not an artisan, he's an artist. He's set apart, he set himself apart, and he sees himself in that way. That's why he paints those portraits, and he is like the star man, he is like a pop star in that way. And that's a very modern thing. And that is given a certain sense of chapter and verse, in that he kept diaries. He kept 2 journals. Specifically, the most important one is when he goes to the Netherlands, when he goes to try and see the whale, when he is wandering around obsessively collecting things, shark fins, parrots, monkeys, coconuts. He has this childlike imagination. That's the other reason why I was really drawn to him. He's like I was when I was a boy, and still am in a way. So I think, but why not write about him? He's just an amazing person to write about, because I can get into a Renaissance mind, as far as I think we can imagine ourselves as what a Renaissance person thought like. And of course, think like us. But it's just they have different cultural stuff going on, and his happened to be the most amazing cultural stuff. And that, and then, sorry, what was your other question, Tony?
Well, you know, yeah, part of it was why you wanted to write this book, and the other element was more around what your writing process is for something like this.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I was mute, was I? My writing process is it's completely unsystematic. It's peripatetic. It happens as I wander about. So I keep a notebook. I'm always writing stuff down there when I'm traveling. Take a lot of photographs, sketch, assemble stuff like it's like a recipe. It's like making a good pasta sauce, and you make it all, and you put the ingredients in, and then you cook and reduce it down until it comes to hopefully something piquant and tasty. So it's a really scattergun approach, and I never plan anything I try not even to plan my travels. I want to be invited to places. I try not to go to places I'm not invited, which is a bit difficult, but try and get myself invited. And just that's the way you find out things, you know. So it's just a journey of its discovery. I try to write the way I discover things, because I think in that way the reader will go with you. But Virginia Woolf said that reading is not a passive act, it's an active act. And so I want to take the reader with me. I want them to be with me when I'm standing in the gallery looking at this amazing picture, when I'm jumping in the river, you know, and yeah, I think, you know, I like to try to communicate the excitement about these things. They are really exciting things. I mean, art is an amazing thing. When you see something by a really extraordinary artist, or even by a crappy artist, it's because it's human generosity. Art is, no one's making you do it. You're doing it because you want to express yourself. And anything where someone's expressed themselves, whatever they're doing, whether they're cooking, playing football, you know, conducting a Zoom, or if they are wanting to do the Zoom, it's the human spirit. And it's the human spirit in operation, and it's a sense of communication and of giving. Yeah.
Great. A quick question stroke almost clarification from one of our viewers is, you mentioned the hare and Dürer eating the hare. Are we sure? Do you know he ate the hare? It never occurred to this person that he would have.
No, I didn't to me until the curator of the hare told me that. He said that's what he thought had happened. He's the person who knows that image more intimately than anyone else. He's done the most work on it. So I try not to think that when I looked at the picture, because it does sort of change the way you think about it. But if you think about it, they ate hares, you know. A hare on your kitchen table or on the kitchen floor really is supper, you know. Yeah, sorry. I don't like the idea either.
No, but there's the clarification for you, viewer. So thank you. And maybe I'm going to ask another question, and then I just wanted to give Carol Burns is still with us. If she wanted to throw a question in, then the chance will be coming up, only if she'd like to. So here's a question from another audience member. With your love of wild swimming, this person wonders if you've read Deacon's waterlog about his swimming around the UK. A lot of it is in and around Hampshire particularly.
Yeah, he's an amazing writer. I've never read him purposely. I don't want to be influenced. I never read books about swimming, especially the Deacon. I mean, he's such a legendary writer. I just don't want to pick up on him. It's a shame because I'm missing out on him. And I think in a year or so I will maybe get round to him. But yeah, and you know, I know he's a big influence from Rob McFarlane, who is a friend of mine. And I don't, because I don't want to fight. I think if I have this superstition, if I read him, I'll start imitating him. And I don't want to do that, you know. So, so I'm really, it's a really self-negating thing to policy, really. But yeah, he's the man, isn't he? But yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. Carol has confirmed in the sidelines that she would like to ask a question. So she's in the stream. Carol, over to you.
Oh, great. This has been so wonderful to listen to. Thank you so much. God, I'm not sure where to start. Okay, well, one thing I love about your work, Philip, is how you just interweave so many different people and ideas and elements and then your own story as well. And just wondering, you know, how do you manage to do that? How do you manage that?
It's a lot of overwriting. I write far too much. It's really ineffective. It's really, or inefficient rather. Hopefully it's effective. Yeah, so all my books are at least twice as long. Albert and the Whale is the most difficult book I've ever written. Really the most difficult book I've ever written.
I can see why. There's so many different things going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You imagine when that was twice that length.
Yeah.
It was like the Magic Mountain itself. But it's, as you know, much better than me, Carol. It's all about editing. It's like it's the editing. People sometimes think they're writing, and you and I teach this, so we know this. And you think you've written it. Oh yeah, I've written it then. Oh, that's good.
Yes.
No. So you've got, and also it's as you know, it's also that's also sometimes the most enjoyable part, because you find out what it's about. You find out what you're trying to do, don't you? And I know, what you and I teach, which is creative nonfiction. Well, it's what I teach with you anyway. Is a really strange sort of chimera of a thing, because no one's really decided what it is. But what I really love about it is there's something rather subversive about what you and I do. It's because it's like there aren't any labels for it, really. I mean, it's not defined. There's no definition for it. So there's a great deal of freedom there, I think. And that's what, I hate the idea of writing as being some kind of homework or assignment. It's got to be fun, isn't it? You spend how much bloody time doing it, and also really cost ineffective. I mean,
that's amazingly cost effective.
Yeah. So if you're not enjoying it, you've got to really love the chase, and then the working out of what it really is all about. And when it works, it's amazing. It's really amazing.
Well, there's a moment. It's about 2/3 of the way through the book, I think, where the as you're bringing in different elements, we have Max Sebald's brought in, and Marianne Moore, and Herman Melville and Dürer. And I saw at some point, is this your ideal dinner party?
It's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is. It's exactly what it is. I want to hang out with those people.
Yeah.
I mean, if you could hang out with Thomas Mann, Herman Melville, Marianne Moore, and maybe chuck in Oscar Wilde and Nina Simone or something, and oh my goodness, that's the great thing, isn't it? You can invent that, and you can be with them, At one point, I set Marianne Moore and Thomas Mann and Auden off in a submarine. I just thought, that's a great idea. They get in this submarine and with Queequeg as the second mate. So you can do that.
Yeah.
It was great. I think we got to be a little bit closer to them through reading the book as well, which is really nice. Yeah.
That's the whole point, isn't it? And especially with someone because I'd known a little bit about Marianne Moore. I just knew her from that famous photograph of the Gotham bookmark with her and Auden and Spender and Elizabeth Bishop and Gore Vidal. I think Tennessee Williams is in there as well. And she's this demure. She looks like your granny. She looks like she's just wandered in off the street to use the toilet. And she's the most incredible poet. She sort of knocks all of them out of the ballpark. I mean, she's just explosive. And she's sitting there in her one-room apartment in Greenwich Village, perched on the sofa because there's no desk. She and her mother eat dinner on the bath because they haven't got a table. And she produces the most extraordinary poems. I mean, so to experience a little bit of her, is really, it's just amazing. That's why I love it. Yeah, it's like being a member of a fan club and getting to meet your, the person.
Yes.
Person.
That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, we haven't got long left. So what I want to try and do, there's 2 more questions that have come in, but I'm just going to set up the next piece. So maybe Carol could stay with us now, because to mark World Book Night, what I'd like to do is ask those watching to throw into the comments your favorite book, or the book that you're reading at the moment, maybe, or one that you most recommend to other people. And we'll just see if there are any reactions from Philip and Carol as authors to those ideas. So please start doing that, those watching. And to give you some time, there's 2 more questions coming in, again, more kind of around the writing process. So one is from an English department graduate, So going off the previous answer, your writing is really striking at times. Do you have any writers that have really inspired you or influenced your style?
Oh gosh, yeah. Where do you start? I mean, recently it's been Herman Melville, just because of the wildness of Moby Dick. It's such a wild book. It's sexy, subversive, maddening, completely lacking in structure and any kind of I mean, he could have edited that quite a lot, but it's what a writer. I mean, just that's the best century, the best novel of the best book of the 19th century by far. Max Seebach, W.G. Seebach, as Carol mentioned, the great German writer of the 20th century, died in 2001, sadly. Taught German at UEA. His book, The Rings of Saturn, really changed the way I thought about writing and what's allowable. Completely liberated me. Marianne Moore now is in a similar vein. Her writing, really, really important to me. Those are three writers who I'd really would cling to if I was cast adrift and had to claim 3 books from the floating wreckage. But Melville is my main man. He really is. God, I'd love to have met him. I met his direct descendant once in New Bedford, and he had Melville's eyes. His weird blue eyes. Freaky, really freaky.
Yeah. Well, that's great. That's great material for World Book Night there already. And, on Moby Dick, I know you've done a lot about that, haven't you, in the past? And big news. Yeah, so that's great material. Sticking with that, and you mentioned how Melville could have edited. So the final question from an audience member at the moment is: do your editors actually help, or do you present a very finished manuscript?
It's pretty finished now. I've made 9 books. I kind of know how it works, really. I try and preempt the editors. They have suggestions, but partly because my editor, Nick Pearson at Fourth Estate, and I know him really well now. I've done most of my books have been published with Fourth Estate, my recent ones, and he knows when he commissions a book from me, he knows what it's going to be like. He knows it's going to be mad. So from an editorial point of view, he's quite prepared not to do an awful lot of editing unless he thinks something is really wrong or it's much too long. Ab and the Whale is actually quite a short book. It's the shortest book I've written for ages. But it took a lot of writing to make a short book. But in earlier, I had really amazing editors. Mitzi Angel was an amazing editor. She was edited one of my early books. She edited England's Lost Eden. She now runs FSD Farrar Straus Giroux in New York. She was head of Faber here. Amazing woman. Editors are really important. As you get hopefully better at what you do, it's their implicit support that's really important. Their encouragement. They're your bloody therapist. They really are your therapist. Nick is my therapist. He knows what to say and what not to say. And they stop you seeing the bad reviews, which is probably the most important thing an editor can do.
You don't get any bad reviews, Philip. Come on.
I got one bad review for Albert and the Whale, but yeah. So editors, you can really hate them sometimes, but like your best friend, you can hate your best friend sometimes, but you're really attached to them umbilically, by the umbilical cord. It's as you. I know you know this, Carl. It's such a you're so bloody fragile as a writer. When it comes to like publication, you're so freaked out by the whole process that you are there's a lot of hand holding needed, isn't there?
Yeah, it's helpful for have somebody have the just right touch of being constructive and super encouraging.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, just a reminder to viewers, throw in your favorite book, your recommended book, the book you're reading at the moment in the spirit of World Book Night. Philip, you referred to some already, Moby Dick, and then three of your kind of people who inspire you. Maybe Carol, I don't know if you've got any that you'd like to throw out there. One, just while you're thinking for a moment, maybe from the audience, is Kurt Vonnegut's, well, quite a lot of his works, but in particular, Mother Night.
Not read it. He's amazing writer, and I can see why that's very inspiring. Like, funnily enough, I met his son in New Bedford as well, at the same place that I met Emma Melville's descendant. Weird, but yeah, I haven't read him. I really want to.
Well, there you go, everyone. The recommendation is Mother Night, and especially if you want to escape our current apocalyptic times and dive into some others, that's the book for you. Carol, any thoughts?
Oh gosh, I think earlier you had said you kind of want us to know what we were reading now, and so of course I'm reading Rebecca Smith's new novel, The Ash Museum, in preparation for our event Monday night with Writers in Conversation. So, and that is a wonderful novel, I have to say. I'm so enjoying it. It has this wonderful structure of, it's called The Ash Museum, and the ash is the family that the novel revolves around. And it has this wonderful structure of we get an object, and then there's a story around that object, and then there's another object, and we learn the story of this family from 1920s on a tea plantation in India to 1970s Surrey, and get this really wonderful story. And Rebecca has a very sly sense of humor as well that sneaks in. So I'm really, really enjoying that. And then other things I'm reading right now is I'm actually reading The Waves by Virginia Woolf. Fabulous. But oh my gosh, I need to be focused and awake and to get it. Otherwise, it's just I want to get as much out of it as I can. And then I'm also reviewing a book for the Washington Post next month called Love and Fury, a novel of Mary Wollstonecraft. Huh? So that's interesting, and you'll have to wait to see what I think.
Excellent.
Great. I suppose I should flick mine up. So obviously I've just finished this one, given tonight's event, and then
me too.
There you go. And given yesterday's event about Earth Day, it was this one, Driven to Extinction: The Impact of Climate Change on Biodiversity.
That is.
And then a bit of classic as well.
I've just been reading that again. It's by my bed.
Great.
By my bed. It's the most brilliant book.
Yeah, I'm enjoying.
I've been reading this as well. This is where I ripped the cover of my book off from. It's a little exclusive for you.
Oh, nice.
Published it. That's what you can see why I ripped it. Actually, hold up the book. Have you got the book?
Me, yes.
Tony, have you got the book? I just said just to show.
Yes, you can see.
Similar,
plagiarism. But David Copperfield. What an amazing book. He's the man, really.
Yeah.
He's amazing. And The Waves, love The Waves. And Rebecca's book is amazing too. Go out and buy Rebecca's book, The Ash Tree. It's fantastic.
I've just put some links on. We have a blog, Writers in Conversation at .wordpress.com, I think it is. I'm sure you'll be able to Google it. And I put some links up to both October Books and P.G. Wells, where she's also having a launch that you can find. So yeah, do it.
Yeah, that's great.
Links
appeared in that.
Yeah, I know October Books have got my book as well. So
right.
Yeah. Oh well, actually, I realise we're almost on time, so let's come to the end of the evening. One final book recommendation from the audience was, I've lost it, A Ripening Seed by Colette and Everything Else by Her. That's that one.
Interesting.
So
I'm
thanks.
going to mention that that audience member is Rebecca Smith, who is our guest on Monday. So
Oh, there you go then. Good
yeah,
taste. Well, okay, we better draw things to a close because it's 8:30 already. Time
Wonderful.
flies when you're having fun.
great.
So Carol, thank you very much for your contributions tonight. It's been really
Yeah,
great.
thank you.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
I suppose just to say a couple of last things. Tonight's event, we've got a little survey. The survey, the link to the survey is about to pop up in the comments with the code that you need to enter to fill it in. And you'll see on the survey, it's not only asking for your thoughts on tonight's event, but also there's a couple of questions in there to get your take on books and on Albert and the Whale in particular, maybe from what you've heard tonight. So do fill that survey in for us, and that would be really appreciated. The recording of this event will be available on these same channels, so you can watch it again and you can share it with others who you think might like to watch it. And I think the last thing I wanted to do, and then hand over to Philip for the last word, is mention, we talked about reviews a moment ago. Albert and the Whale has been getting some amazing reviews since it was released last month in March. There was one that came out last week in The Spectator. And the final word from me, I just wanted to give the very short quote from that, which was, "In Albert and the Whale, Philip has made something reckless, marvelous, and unforgettable. Dürer would have loved it. So will you." Philip, over to you.
I just want to read a little quote from Marianne Moore. It's just one line. "If what you had been reading savours of mythology, could I make it up? And if I could, would I impose it on you?" Thank you.